I'm Caroline Modaresi-Tehrani. You're watching HuffPost Live. Whether it be foreign policy, immigration, or the economy, bipartisanship, doesn't exactly jump out at you in our politics today. But an organisation spearheaded by Joan Blades called Living Room Conversations is trying to change that. And joining me now to discuss how they do it are Joan Blades, founding partner of Living Room Conversations, Deborah Molyneux, managing partner of Living Room Conversations, and Ralph Benko, a conservative partner with Living Room Conversations. So thank you all for joining me today. And, Joan, I'll start with you. First of all, what are Living Room Conversations? How do they work?
Living Room Conversations are just a very simple structure. Two friends with different viewpoints, each invite two friends for a structured conversation where they've agreed to follow certain guidelines, sort of what you've learned in kindergarten. Take turns, be curious, take responsibility for the conversation, and it works. And then they go through a structure of first why you're there and some of your hopes and concerns for your community, and then whatever the issue area that the co-hosts have agreed and invited their guests to come talk about.
So Deborah, what kind of conversations are we talking about here? What are the subjects and themes?
So we have a whole list of topics online, and then there's also a generic packet that people can customize for themselves. But there's things on there like crony capitalism, money in politics, immigration, some criminal justice ones that we did in California called Realignment. We have some adaptations that happened on climate change and sustainability. So there's a ton out there.
So it kind of runs the gamut. All right, well, Ralph, talk to me about the proof in the pudding here. What have you seen shift when people actually engage in these conversations about issues, particularly ones as divisive as crony capitalism, for example?
The power of conversation is enormous, and by every coin has two sides, heads and tails. By hating the other side away, by ignoring the other side, by holding the other side in contempt, instead of honoring both sides of the coin, you can develop a whole new level of integrity among the citizens who can help guide Washington into the paths of righteousness.
I want to just share with everybody the mission statement of the Living Room Conversations, and it's this, quote, "We live with the dysfunction of partisan behaviours and we believe we must and can do better. We have faith in the goodwill, intelligence and power of citizens." Joan, where does that faith come from?
I'm a co-founder of Move On and Moms Rising, and so my exposure to the participation of regular citizens is that they're amazing, and they're kind, and they're intelligent. And when we engage them and they're able to participate, we have much better outcomes.
So, where do you think that this idea of gridlock then comes from? Not only within politics, with the Congress and the White House administration, the Obama administration, the White House, for example, but also sort of on a day-to-day level in communities. There is a sort of sense that, well, that side won't buy what I'm selling and vice versa. Where do you think that comes from, Deborah?
So, a lot of that comes from people just wanting to be right. They get their rhetoric down and they're part of their tribe. And it becomes very important for people to be right. And one of the things that we really focus on with Living Room Conversations is the quality of the relationship. Because if we find out that we actually have things in common, then a whole world of possibilities opens up that wasn't possible before.
So, let's talk about something that seems that everyone should have in common, for example. Let's turn to politics for a second. Ralph, let's talk about the sex trafficking bill that looks like at the moment it's DOA. I've got a Politico article here, how abortion politics scuttled a human trafficking bill. Here it seemed like it was an issue that both Democrats and Republicans were agreeing on. Of course, people want to put an end to human trafficking, and yet there isn't a consensus. A large part, according to the Democrats anyway, the Republicans snuck in abortion language. When you see this kind of story, what goes through your mind?
Well, first of all, I was one of the three lead community organizers under George W. Bush's Department of Health and Human Services to rescue human trafficking victims. It was an operation called Rescue and Restore. We actually doubled the rate. So this is an issue that I have very close to my heart. That said, a lot of times there are other issues that are attached to other issues, and then they kind of bring everything to a crashing halt. That's just part of the political process. It's not really, it's always spoken of as gridlock and as a bad thing, but there are real arguments to be had, and it's okay to have them.
I suppose that for people in the general public, then even within the sort of politics framework of being on the Hill. These things may be part and parcel, but I think to the general public, Joan, when they see this kind of story, they see an issue that seems bipartisan and then all of a sudden it falls to the wayside because of something that seems very partisan, people become disillusioned. How should we see through this sort of story?
I would like people to start taking responsibility and saying, well, it's time for Washington to be far more responsive to the citizens outside of Washington. And we are hoping that if we can get large numbers of people talking to each other and overcoming what really has become, as we've kind of teased ourselves apart and live in increasingly homogeneous communities, when we start reconnecting and we come together to leadership and say, we need this done, and we're serious, I believe we will be taken seriously.
I mean, describe to us a situation where that's happened. Have you seen this in practice yet? I mean, I know these conversations have been going on. Have you seen a result or a kind of conclusion from one of them that surprised you or gave you hope that this really does work?
2 years ago, Ralph introduced me to Mark Meckler, who's a co-founder of Tea Party Patriots. He said, Tea Party and Move On co-founders, they should have a conversation. Ralph was right.
I was right.
Ralph is often right.
Doesn't often happen.
Strangely
I was
enough.
right this time.
Why did you think
Okay.
that needed to happen, though? Because I feel like, those are, two differing sort of, again, sides of the political aisle that most people would think that if you came together, the, room would explode probably.
Well, I'm going to let Joan answer that question, but if I'm happy to make my observation. When she surprises you with a fantastic answer, she was there. I just introduced them, and
But you thought that there was a reason to. I guess, why did you think that there was a
yes, because
important purpose to?
because they're both citizen activists. They're both leaders of citizen activism, and the most important secret about Washington that your viewers probably don't know is the power of citizens on congressional offices. This is not generally known, and there's no sinister reason. Okay, they never hear from the folks back home. They're dying to hear from the folks back home. They're hearing from the media. They're hearing from the donors. They're hearing from the leadership. But and they're hearing from pressure groups. But they're very, very rarely hearing from their constituents, and their constituents are the gold standard of influence over elected officials. They're the ones who count far more than the money, far more than the leadership, far more than the media. I'm sorry. No,
I think that's.
Don't take that personally.
Well,
okay?
I mean, I think that's a good point. I mean, yeah, we're the mouthpieces supposedly.
So we've
Well, I mean, that's the point
defaulted.
of
We,
us.
as citizens, to the extent we've defaulted, Congress has to make it up as it goes along. Joan has created, in Move On, which I am, by the way, the one dissident member among 8 million members.
You keep saying that, Ralph.
But it's true. I
The
disagree.
lone dissident. Well, I take your point, and I want to come back to kind of citizen engagement in a moment. But tell us about your meeting with Mark then, Mark Meckler.
Mark and I decided to co-host a conversation about crony capitalism. He invited 2 of his friends, I invited 2 of my friends. We honestly didn't know where this was going to go. And we had this just marvelous conversation about the things we agree on in that space. I learned, and I didn't know this before, that there's near universal agreement that we have way too many people in prisons. The war on drugs is a failure. We have to start using evidence-based practices in how we deal with people that get into the criminal justice system. And the more I've learned, the more I've been, wow, yeah, we agree on so much here. And I've been able to write op-ed, Grover Norquist, with Matt Kibbe, and there's this wonderful coalitions that are coming out. The Coalition for Public Safety recently launched. And Van Jones is working with Newt Gingrich.
Yeah.
It's time to really see if we are standing side by side and saying, we need this, and we need it now.
Well, so the fascinating thing is that when we had the start of this conversation, you were talking about the simple rules that people need to abide by when they're conducting these living room conversations. Develyn, they sound very simple.
They're very simple.
And yet, as Boring File Clerk writes, he's watching us now, he says, our system of government is broken. Both parties are failing to act like proper adults and leaders. This stems into regular conversation as well, right? Sometimes adults find themselves acting more like children than actual adults. How do you keep people adhering to the rules?
Well, we do ask people, for the sake of this 2 or 3 hour conversation, to suspend judgment. So that's the first one. So be open and curious to learning. And what's really amazing is when people start with that intention in mind, when you actually sit down to have the conversation and you read the ground rules and everybody gets on board, it creates this safe place for people to actually reveal who they are and what they care about. And so those are the things that we all need to remember and to tend to, is to make it safe for people to talk with us and share with us their heart. And when that happens, that's when we find the common ground that we can actually go out and create a better world together.
So I have to ask, because people, I'm sure, would be curious. So where do you each fall on the political spectrum? Ralph, I'll start with you, if people couldn't guess.
Deeply, deeply, deeply conservative. So conservative that in the green room I've got a black hat. Because I'm old school.
He doesn't really.
I do really. I do. Go look, go see for yourself.
Deborah Lynn, what about you?
I am a moderate independent.
All right, then Joan.
I'm the founder of Move On. And I live in Berkeley. I was born there. But the reality is that I have concluded that the partisan conflict is not serving us, and that I am fundamentally a mediator by origin and training, and I believe that adversarial problem solving is a disaster.
Yeah.
So when I can care about Ralph, and Ralph cares about me, and we can have a conversation about whatever issue, then the outcome we have together is going to be so much better than if we're both in defensive crouches trying to come up with a solution that's most like mine.
So, I mean, talk to me about how, I think that people watching at home will be nodding their heads in agreement, first of all. I think people are clamoring for this kind of adult, if you want to call it adult, but just sort of pleasant discourse within people of different political viewpoints. To evince that point, Pew recently conducted a survey as soon as the midterm elections were over. And I've got it here. Few see a quick cure for nation's political divisions. A large majority expects no progress on top problems facing the United States. 81% say the country is more politically divided these days in the past. So that's the consensus from the general public. And then you see an issue, Ralph, like Iran, for example. We've seen in the last few weeks a lot of mudslinging back and forward on the issue of Iran. 47 senators that the New York Daily News called traitors. We've had mudslinging on both sides. How do you see an issue like that, people actually listening? As Deborah Lynn said, hearing each other's hearts on an issue.
Well, I've been in 120 congressional offices in the last year, and they are almost universally Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, filled with smart, civic-minded people who are dedicated, even if they disagree with each other, dedicated with transforming the world and making the world better than they found it. So I want your listeners, rather than to express disgust and say, oh, what's wrong with those people? This is not about those people. This is about us. We have the power to transform the world, and Joan and Debbie Lynn are making it easier by creating livingroomconversations.org. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay. So instead of nodding your head and saying yes, it should be like that, or shaking your head and saying how could they do that, engage. Go to livingroomconversations.org. Whatever your perspective is, your 1 or 2 right-wing viewers and your millions of left-wing viewers, let everybody engage and participate and listen.
Well, I mean, it's true, because it's in many ways what we do at HuffPost Live. We have community, we have conversations involving different types of political background, race, creed, colour, you name it. I think this is sort of what we aspire to do here anyway.
Yes,
there's definitely a room for that.
Listen to the other side. Try to find out what the other side's narrative is without it being distorted through the lens of the media, and let anybody who's interested in discovering what your narrative is listen to you.
So on the issue then of Iran, for example, what do you think would happen if John Boehner and the president, or John Boehner and Harry Reid, sat down in a living room conversation and actually discussed the issue? Do you feel like they would be able to feel comfortable to show one another their hearts when they are in this political system that doesn't seem to allow for that kind of honesty?
I'd like to believe they could. I think that's probably the toughest ask we could possibly make. We're not we're not starting in Washington, D.C., honestly. That's the town where they have a lot of perverse incentives for not getting along. And I have more confidence that outside of D.C., people can do this successfully. All the conversations we know about have been successful. Could they do it? You know, they just might be able to. I like to believe they would.
Devlin, what do you think?
Well, I just wanted to add here that a lot of what our strategy is to have the citizens engage, as Ralph has said, so that we, the citizens, understand how much we have in common, and then we contact our congressional leaders and start saying, here's what we found we have in common, and here's what we would think should happen. And when you have that type of consensus from your constituency, it makes it really a lot easier, I think, to resist the donors and the lobbyists and all the special interest groups that are influencing them above the common good.
Well, I've got a couple of comments here from people who are watching as well. This is from Rona Barry Morin, who says, my husband and I have many different points of view. So yes, I do take the time to stop and listen to another person's point of view. And another one here from Boring File Clerk says, people can disagree and not be enemies. I think that's the thing, right, Ralph? Like, yes. People feel like when they disagree on an issue, it's sort of spun as if they hate each other and they're sort of staunch enemies, when perhaps that's not the case.
That's much better TV. So all of the civil disagreements they're boring, so they tend not to get televised. That said, look, Washington is very malleable to the opinion of the citizenry. If enough of your viewers will set a good example by joining this parade, by going to livingroomconversations.org or some comparable event, it's better, it's more influential if they do it under a common brand, so to speak, because it becomes more visible. Okay, Washington will fall into line. Mm-hmm. Just don't, instead of shaking fingers, set a good example.
Yeah, I mean, Joan, I guess a final thought on this, because we're running out of time, but, how can people really make their voices heard? I think a lot of people feel disenfranchised. They feel like their voice doesn't matter. How can they make their voice penetrate through some of this noise?
Right now, talking about living room conversations, I'm suggesting that people think of what they're most passionate about. And, for me, when I first started talking about this, I was asking about climate, because I wanted to know why conservatives weren't concerned like I was. And when I talked about it in 2005 with leadership of the Christian Coalition, we were really able to have a thoughtful dialogue and help each other understand. I realized 5 years later that conversation could no longer happen because the partisan barriers had grown much more impenetrable. And it's very hard to kind of expect a democracy to thrive when you're living in separate reality streams.
Sure.
It's separate narratives, separate realities. My conservative friends have a completely different understanding of fracking than I do. And I'd really like to know if my facts are in fact facts, or if they have facts that would actually modify mine. We have trusted experts. So we need to really start at the very beginning here. And my starting place is, let's start having relationships that are really caring and listening so that we can figure out what the next steps are together.
Well, it sounds like a really great idea, and I'm glad that it's actually working in practice. Guys, thank you very much for joining me today on HuffPost Live. It's been such a pleasure. And guys, thanks for joining us as well. For more information on Living Room Conversations, you can check out the links in our resource well below. Stick around. Nancy Redd is up next, talking about raising the age for tobacco purchases. Don't miss it.